Mattys Mental Health Podcast, aiming to spread awareness on mental health by sharing the real-life stories of those who've experienced it firsthand. Okay, I'll do it again. Hannah McGaughey is here today. How you doing, Hannah?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm very good, very good. Thank you for coming on, agreeing to do this. I know we've been kind of planning this out for a little while, so it's good to
Yeah,
finally make it
awesome
happen.
to finally do this.
Yeah. So tell me about how you're doing. You survived the COVID, the lockdown.
Oh boy, it's been quite a journey. I actually go to school in Toronto, so I was kind of stuck there the first month, and then I made it back here, and it was very difficult being locked up in my house for 2 weeks. But
Right.
I think now that everything's kind of opening up again, it's made it a lot easier. I don't think people are meant to live in isolation. So
No,
I
100% not.
definitely think it's been a lot easier in every aspect now that things are kind of normalizing.
Right. So when did you come back from Toronto?
I got back the third week of April.
Okay, yeah, right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that must have been interesting to go through the whole
Yeah,
isolation.
it was
Quarantine yourself, I guess.
sorry?
Quarantine yourself, I guess.
Yes, no, it was very very different to go from once lockdown happened, there wasn't as much freedom, but it was very different to go back to living with my parents when I had been very accustomed to having a lot of freedom, living on my own, and then coming back and going to the exact opposite of what I had come to know.
Right.
So that made it difficult.
Classic. Feel like you're a kid again when you go back.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So we talked a little bit about your story and stuff like that before, just kind of a general rundown. But if you want to kind of get into it, you can start wherever you want.
Yeah. So basically, I think that it's really interesting to see in a way, like a generational shift. It seems like most people within our age cohort say, oh, like around this time is when things kind of started going south. But and like our parents think that's strange. But in all honesty, I think it's just because there's more like normalization, which is good. But like a lot of folks, yeah, around like 13, 14, I was just having a very rough go at it. I actually went to a private school, and I was with the same group of people for the past like 8 years. And it was just not a very great environment. I didn't grow up in a troublesome household to the extent that some people do, but there are definitely things that we didn't talk about, and issues and past trauma that just kind of we swept under the rug. So then kind of hit this point of being a young teenager, and it kind of felt like everything like hit the fan all at once. And I remember like going to school, my mom would actually have to drag me out of the car because I was crying so much because I didn't want to go. And I struggled a lot with trying to figure out like what was wrong with me, for lack of a better turn of phrase, because the environment that I was in was an environment of, in one sense, there was a mixture of toxic positivity mixed in with like, oh, well, those emotions are bad, so we don't talk about them, we don't accept them. So it was really difficult. I struggled a lot trying to feel adequate, trying to feel like I was going to ever be happy again. And I struggled a lot with just a lot of anxiety and this deep, deep loneliness and self-harm. And it was just a lot of grasping at straws for ways to cope with it. And then eventually, when I was about 15, I actually started going to therapy for the first time. And that was really helpful. I'm really, really lucky that I have a great family doctor. I love her. And she was amazing in actually like listening to what I had to say and suggesting, that I actually seek outside help. And then high school came. I actually changed schools for high school, which I think is honestly one of the best decisions I ever made, which sounds silly, but it's true.
Could you describe, just, I don't mean to cut you off,
Yeah,
but
no.
could you describe like a little bit more of like the toxic culture in the private school, or like just kind of what affected you there?
Yeah, so I just remember this unbelievable like power dynamic and in a sense an abuse of that power. I remember, so to give you a very general idea of what my experience at school was like, we're going to go all the way back to grade 1, grade 2. I had a teacher in grade 1 and 2, because we had split classes, that if you did something bad, you did something wrong or whatever, she would tell you, shame on you, hide your face. And what you had to do was put your hands like this and your head down at your desk until she permitted you to look back up again. So that's a very like defining example, I feel, of the culture that permeated that entire school. A lot of shaming people in kind of indirect ways, a lot of sexism. Girls were very policed on what they wore, and just being, and I'm also the only girl in my immediate family, and I'm the youngest. So there's a lot of that intertwining between just shame in general and then shame on being like a girl and all of this. And I remember, teachers yelling at students if they didn't do as well on a test as they should have, right? And just not, and I've worked with kids a lot, and it's just, I've worked with kids at like after school programs and camps and stuff like that. And I always model my approach kind of exactly the opposite of what I experienced in school, because in retrospect, it was really damaging. And I was actually talking to a friend recently who actually stayed at that school all the way until grade 12, and they graduated from there. And we were just talking about how unbelievably, like, how much that those little traumas add up and affect you. And it's something that I've kind of only recently been coming to terms with, despite the fact that it's been, oh gosh, like 6 years since I was even in that building. So it was just a horrendous culture. And then in my own family life, there was a lot of only think happy thoughts. If you're not feeling well, just think happy, think positive, like force a smile because, endorphins will be released. And okay, yes, scientifically there is some truth to that, but it's not enough to fix a lot of internal pain and struggle.
And traumas.
Yeah, no. So when I was very young, I experienced a pretty traumatic experience. And like a lot of young kids, I never had a firm grasp on it. And then it was kind of interesting because as I said, everything kind of hit the fan around 13, 14. And I just remember begging my mother, begging her to tell me what happened to me because there's no way that like with the way I felt and all of these things, I was like, something doesn't feel right. And eventually she kind of confirmed my suspicions. And, you know, I, on one hand, was devastated because it meant that I was right. But on the other hand, I was relieved in a sense because it meant that I could kind of put a name to it and kind of identify that. And it felt less scary in that sense because it didn't feel like I was just in an unknown world as much. I actually kind of had an idea of where things may have started to go wrong. And then that initial trauma going into this toxic environment in school, but never having dealt with that trauma, and then it all just kind of snowballing and piling up.
So there was less of the fear of the unknown.
Yeah, I guess so. And when I went into high school, that's when, you know, things started. Okay, well, what do we put a name to this? Do we call this anxiety? Do we call this depression? Is it both? What is it, kind of thing? And kind of played that game for a decent amount of time. And it wasn't until last year that I actually got in touch with an actual psychiatrist. It took a long time. And after our first meeting, she was like, I'm pretty sure that you have borderline personality disorder. And I took abnormal psychology in university. I was like one course shy of being a psychology minor. I really am interested in psychology. And when she said that, it was almost like something clicked because it wasn't unknown anymore. It was very much like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense because I've read about this personality disorder. I am familiar with like what it is. And now that you say that, it explains so much of my responses and my behavior and the way I've felt. So really getting to the point where there was actually like a solid name to it for myself was really helpful. And I know for some people, they see it as it can be a detrimental thing to have that. But for me, it was very comforting.
So you can start to navigate now that you finally know what's actually going on.
Yeah. And it, because borderline personality disorder, BPD for short, a really big thing in it is this intense fear of abandonment, whether it is perceived or real. So essentially, that leads you to having a lot of unstable relationships. So as I was saying earlier, I was going through this time and feeling very alone. So a lot of the time what people with BPD will do is they will either cling on to someone because they recognize this person is going to leave me. I'm going to do my best to get all the love and affection and attention I can before they wake up and leave me. Or the other option is to go, this person's going to leave me. I'm going to push them away. That way at least the hurt is on my own terms. And looking back, that explained so much of like my feeling alone because I always had very turbulent friendships. It seemed like I could never like be someone's best friend. I always felt like in the background or like a secondary character because I just didn't know how to healthily have relationships with people. And that's still a really, really difficult thing. But I feel like now I'm able to navigate it more because I can stop and say, okay, wait, I recognize what this behavior is and what I'm doing. And, oh, I need to remember my terms from abnormal psych. But personality disorders tend to be egosyntonic, which means that the individual who is suffering does not believe that their behavior is abnormal. So, and then like mood disorders would be ego dystonic. I might have the terms mixed up, but I think that's what they are, where you recognize your behavior is abnormal. So for a lot of people with PPD, self-harm is a really, really prominent symptom that a lot of people have. And I remember thinking, and it's still difficult for me to wrap my mind around it, why do people think this behavior is so scary? Why do people think this behavior is so strange? It's not. It's everyone does this, right? Everyone feels this way. Everyone thinks that everyone is going to leave them constantly. And then going back to being able to put a name on what I've been dealing with, even though in my head I still can't actually wrap my mind around the fact that other people don't feel that way. Intellectually, I'm able to know that it's not normal and it's not okay. Normal in the sense of normal being healthy.
Right.
But yeah.
I have a few questions here.
Yeah.
I don't mean to backtrack and keep bringing it back to the school, but
Oh my gosh, no, go for it.
first one being, like, was this a religious school? Like, you don't have to say the name of it or anything, but
yeah. It was a Baptist school. I actually grew up in a very interesting religious situation. Both my parents were raised very Catholic, but my mother is a very evangelical person, and then I went to a Baptist school.
Okay.
So there was a lot of intermixing, but a key theme in my own experience that I saw in all of those kind of institutions was using guilt and shame as a tool. So that's definitely, you know, I have said to people before, I can do virtually, or I can do virtually nothing without feeling shame. Like, I feel guilty and shame for virtually everything because so much of the way I was brought up, particularly in school, was through tactics of shame and guilt to make people, you know, using fear as a way to teach people a lesson or whatever.
Yeah.
A lot of, like I said before, when I mentioned that teachers would yell at students if they didn't do as well on a test, like public shaming of people would happen. You
So
know,
just like in front of everyone, like you
yeah,
get the test back and then they start yelling at someone like you should have did better in front of
I
everybody.
have a very vivid memory of grade 5. There was a kid who had just come to our school. He had been going to public school before. And I remember the teacher calling him up to her desk and yelling at him for a straight half hour because he got like a 70 on this test. I do remember the next day she apologized and said she shouldn't have done that in front of everyone, but also she shouldn't have done it in the first place.
100%.
Yeah.
And then even that small example, and I think that was a good one that you said of like hide your face. You should be ashamed of yourself. Hide your face. That's like, oh my God. Like, imagine, you know, I've worked at after school programs too in kids camps. I couldn't imagine saying that to a kid. Like, that doesn't even make sense in any way, shape, or form to teach them anything.
And
right?
like, it wasn't until I mentioned it to people years later, because like I said, I switched schools for high school. I went to the rural for high school, and I just remember mentioning it in passing to a friend, and they were like, wait, what? That was a thing? And because that was my experience, I thought it was normal. And it's not okay to do that. So whenever I work with kids, because I think kids are way smarter than we give them credit for. So anytime in the past that I've worked with kids, I've always just gone in with the kids that are the most difficult to love or the ones who need the most love. And I just want to do
100%.
everything in my power to make this kid feel like they are valued and that everything they have to say is valid, because it is. And I keep going back to when I took this abnormal psych course, but it was very interesting. And my prof actually approached everything from a trauma model. That's what she does all of her research based on. And I know for me, I just think that's a very big thing in the way that people behave. And So a lot of the time when I was working with kids, I would say, okay, you're acting this way because of certain circumstances. It doesn't necessarily have to be the worst, most traumatic thing in the world, right? We don't need to get into the trauma Olympics, but you know, and then I'm also a scientist, so every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So a kid acting out is a result of something. So telling them to hide their face in shame and to be, you know, feel wrecked with guilt is not going to do anything helpful.
Just makes them feel like it's their fault for something they, number one, might not understand, and number two, might not be their fault at all.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, I think that for myself, I can look at the course of the life that I have lived and have seen the effects when there is no one to say, wait a minute, are you okay? Or like, it's okay that you're angry right now. It's okay that you're upset. I remember being taught that there are bad emotions. Personally, I don't agree with that dogma. So with BPD, you do a lot of dialectical behavior therapy. And a big thing with that is like mindfulness and this idea that an emotion is simply an emotion. So you just let it be there. You don't try to push it away, and you don't try to hold on to it. But in the experiences that I've had, it was a lot of, oh, that's a bad emotion, push it away, push it away, push it away. And that has not been helpful.
No, it never is to bottle it up.
Yeah.
So that one, you stayed there until grade 8 or grade 9, I guess, eh?
Grade 9, yeah.
And then that sort of behavior continued throughout the whole experience until grade 9.
Yeah. When I switched schools, I definitely found that things kind of got better in a sense, but at the same time, I had been steeped in this culture for so long that it took a really long time to kind of shed some of that. And it took a lot of needing help and getting help. And there was a point in high school where I was very much like, okay, you know what? I'm okay now. Everything is fine. And then you think that, and time goes on, and you realize there's still more work to do. And there's always going to be work to do. But I also, in a way, I don't like saying that, oh, I'm grateful for this experience that it happened, because I'm not. It was traumatic and painful and not fun. However, I can find some comfort in reflecting and saying, okay, I can see how I've grown from that, and I can see how I've become who I am and how I can become a better, kinder person out of all of that.
Right. You see how you can learn from it, opposed to keeping the cycle going and projecting
it on
someone else.
A big thing, once again, with trauma is breaking the cycle. Growing up, one of the things my mom did always tell me was that hurt people hurt people. But I also think that comes with that is that it gets to a point where you do have a choice. And it's very difficult because with any kind of mental health struggle, your behavior, your actions are influenced by that. So there is this kind of game of how much choice do I have right now, and how much of this do I need to make this choice because of just self-preservation and survival and everything. And it's a whole complicated, nuanced situation. But I think part of what I've learned, at least, is that I need to be able to forgive myself for the times that I've made choices that I wouldn't have, but recognize that I made those choices because at the end of the day, my brain is wired in a different way. And when you are faced with a choice that is difficult, oftentimes it can be interpreted as scary. And therefore, I'm going to make this choice And then I might look back when I'm in a better place and say, oh, I shouldn't have made that choice. But I can have compassion for myself that I understand that why I would make that choice, kind of thing. I don't know. It's complicated trying to explain it. The idea of accountability, but then at the same time having compassion for yourself. And of course, compassion for others. I think we're very, at least myself, I'm very, very quick to have compassion for other people. But then when it comes to myself, it's like, oh, no, you have a different set of rules and different things apply to you.
No, I think that's super important. I didn't even cut you off there.
Oh, no.
But I think that's super important. I think that's a lot of people have that like just self-critical of themselves, and just, you know, that goes back to the saying, like, give yourself the advice you would give to someone else.
Yeah.
Because usually we don't do that. And I think it's important what you're saying too about like forgiving yourself for not making the best decision you maybe could have when you weren't well.
Yeah.
Because those I think that's just the kind of things that can eat away at you. But, and it also goes back to the importance of taking care of yourself so you can make the best decisions.
Yeah.
And be your best self, because if you're not taking care of yourself, then you just can't make decisions that you'd like to.
Yeah, and there are times I look back, particularly there was I hit a very, very low point a little bit more than like a year ago, like last year, like probably around May. Essentially, I had kind of found a new group of friends, and this was when I was still really navigating this whole idea of having BPD and the aspect of like unstable relationships with it. And there was a time where I was like, okay, you know what? Like, I feel really hurt by this person. I'm going to stand up for myself. And I went into this conversation like, okay, I'm going to control my anger, and I'm going to do all these things. And then I said, you know, hey, you did this thing. It really hurt me. But I wasn't actually anticipating for the individual that I was talking to actually admit it. And when they admitted it, I kind of just like lost all of those thoughts I had before about I'm going to control my anger and I'm going to be calm and all of these things, because actually hearing the words come out of their mouth saying, yes, I purposely did this and knew that it would hurt you, hearing that made me just go like so angry and upset. And I look back on that situation, and it actually ended up in a really, really messy thing where I ended up going to the hospital, and because this person and we kind of just had my anger resulted in this big miscommunication, and I ended up going to the hospital, and every medical professional I spoke to that day was like, wow, okay, you coming here is actually the exact opposite of what you need. But because in my illness, I wasn't able to communicate that properly to the individual I was confronting. So then they were concerned for me, and it just led to all of exactly not what I needed. So even though I went in being like, I'm in control, and like, I know my emotions and I know how I'm going to deal with this, I didn't. And it's really difficult looking back on that and finding that sense of ownership of my actions while also having self-compassion and recognizing that I was I was in a really bad spot at that time. And I remember like coming home, because they, like every doctor there agreed, like, you should not be here right now. Like, this is the opposite of what you need. But I do remember coming home, and there were just a couple of days where I just laid in bed because I felt like I had made so much progress, and then I felt like someone had just like flicked me off the top of a mountain, and I just fell way back. But then everything kind of slowly shifted and changed, and within a couple of months I was able to look back and be like, I did that. Like, despite being knocked down, despite being not proud of my actions, I have made it back up the mountain to a similar spot of progress. And I think that it's always going to be kind of like that. Always little step backs and stepping forward and all of that kind of stuff. But it's definitely been kind of rolling with the punches and learning how to deal with this properly.
Right. Do you think that's important to take those leaps?
Sorry?
Do you think it's important to take those leaps forward, and just like try those things just to make progress?
I think it is important, but I also think it's important to be very not cautious, because I don't know, I don't want to say that, oh, we should be like afraid, but I think it is important to say, is this the best thing for me right now? Because looking back, I thought, you know what, I've never stood up for myself. I've always let people tell me what to feel, what to do. I've let people, push me around. So I thought I was taking this major step in being like, yeah, I'm going to stand up for myself. I'm going to let this person know that their actions hurt me. But at the same time, looking back, I kind of would be like, Hannah, no, you're not in a place where you're ready to do that yet.
Right.
So I think that was a leap that I took, and I fell hard, and it was difficult and painful getting back up. And while I am kind of like, man, things could have been a lot smoother and a lot nicer if I had waited some time and learned more about myself and how to deal with my emotions and all of that kind of stuff, it would have been a lot more smooth. But at the same time, I can look back and say, hey, okay, I took that leap. I completely and totally failed. But I did make my way back up. I just didn't leap up. I took slow baby steps back up.
Right. So how long did it take you to get a psychologist? You said it took a long time.
Yeah, so I think the first time I ever brought up any of my like mental health issues with my family doctor was when I was either 13 or 14. I did not get referred to a psychiatrist until I was 22. It took a long time. And in part, I think that's because of the way the system is set up. And then also in part, it's because I wasn't always honest with my doctor, because I was afraid. I was like a teenager, and I was very afraid.
Yeah.
And I had kind of hopped around from therapist to therapist and didn't really find a match until like not last fall, but the fall before. I ended up finding a really good match, and it was mostly through her that I was able to get set up with an actual psychiatrist. And she changed my meds all over the place, and I was very, like a lot of people, very resistant to this idea of like taking these medications that have names that we associate with them as being like, oh, like like I take an antipsychotic, and people like that's we view that as such a negative thing, but in actuality it's not a bad thing at all. It's just because of the way that my brain chemistry is wired and all this stuff, and I feel like I'm a better person because I'm able to, through the use of medication and therapy and all this stuff, I'm able to better control and assess my emotions and my behavior and work through a whole bunch of stuff that has led me to the point that I need to do these things. So it took a long time. It took a lot of trial and error. I remember when I had my first appointment with her, I was not happy about it. I did not want to go. I was very much, I'm like, I don't want to do this. I don't like this. And I'll be completely honest. Every time I have an appointment, I'm always like, I don't want to go. But I go because I know that I'll be better for it.
Right. So did you say after one appointment she was able to diagnose you?
Yeah, she was like, okay, this is what I think. And then after the next, I was either after the second or third, she kind of was like, okay, yeah, I'm definitely saying this. Um, but after one appointment, because when you have, or at least in my experience with this doctor, my initial appointment was actually like 3 hours long. It was really long. She took so many notes and she had so many like questionnaires. She observed like all of my behavior, like the way I was sitting and everything, and all this stuff. And, she had me answer these questions on a scale of 1 to 10. And then she just asked me about my past and all of this stuff. And she had talked to my therapist before. So she kind of had some background knowledge of my recent history and like the way that I had been dealing with situations and how I had been feeling. So she did have some background knowledge. But after that appointment, she's kind of like, okay, this is what I'm leaning towards. I'm not going to say for certain. But then eventually after, the second or third appointment, she was like, okay, yeah, this is what's going on right here.
Okay. Right. So you had been on meds before, so was that like therapist or doctor prescribed on the
So
medication?
the meds that I had been on between the ages of like 13 and I guess 22 were all they were prescribed from my family doctor. And I think she definitely did the best she could. I really think she did. Especially since like I said before, I was not always honest with her because I was afraid. So a lot of the kind of red flags that would have said, oh, this person probably should be taking an anti-psych, like they should be taking one. I kept a lot of that in because I was afraid of like what would happen. I didn't want to be put into like inpatient or anything like that. I was very scared, like, oh, if I tell her that like I'm self-harming, like what's she gonna do? But if I had told her a lot earlier, I probably would have been able to see an actual psychiatrist a lot earlier, someone who is a specialist in these kind of things. So when I did start going to my psychiatrist, there was a shift in the types of meds, but they were still, sorry, not within the types, within the specific medication, but still within like the SSRI category and like anti-anxiety kind of medication, just kind of shifting, okay, well, you're taking this one now, let's try this one. And then like the addition of the antipsychotic kind of thing. So there was some similarities and some additions and shifts. But I definitely think that once we landed on the kind of the combination that we have now, I think that I really did see a difference. I don't know. I know some people are very iffy about the idea of taking medication for the long term. But as somebody who I am very, very much interested in science. I almost went to medical school and then I decided to go to theater school, but that's a whole other story. Just from what I've learned, because I've had the privilege of taking classes that discuss these kind of medications and different types of mental health issues. For me, I think it's the best thing that I can do right now.
Right. Did you see um, like improvement, or did it help you like at the time at 13, Was there side effects or kind of like a learning curve with dosages and stuff like that? And then,
It's difficult to remember, simply because of some of the traumas that I faced in my life. I have not the greatest memory, uh, but from as far as I can remember, I do remember thinking after like maybe 3 months, 4 months, I do remember thinking that I did feel better. Um, and that it was easier to get out of bed in the morning. I was still devastated going to school every day. But I remember it being like, okay, maybe okay, yeah, like things are getting a little bit better. Um, Essentially, in my experience, it was a lot of, okay, let's start at this dose. And then the next appointment, it would be like, okay, how are you feeling? Do you think you want to try an increased dose, or do you want to stay where you are? I have a really great doctor. She's very I don't well versed with kind of like a patient focused approach. So a lot of it was collaboration and like making those decisions together, which I really appreciate. So there was a lot of like shifting and kind of playing with it. And then I was on the same kind of SSRI for a long time, maybe like 4 or 5 years before I was like, you know what? I don't know if this is doing it anymore. Can we try something else? And then we did, and all that kind of thing. So there was a lot of that kind of making like kind of micro adjustments as we went along. But within that, it was kind of, once again, rolling with the punches, trying to decide what worked, what didn't. And I was really lucky that I actually got to have some say in it, because a lot of people don't have that luxury.
right, 100%. So, and then you felt better like just recently when you got on the new.
Yeah, so this past year, a little bit more than a year of being kind of on this new combination of meds. So another thing with BPD, another characteristic of it is impulsive behavior. So that can be a bunch of things. That can just be like being reckless with your money, sabotaging relationships. That can be, using recreational drugs like dangerously when it's something like you've never done before, and you're just like, oh, I'm just gonna go ahead and dive into this. And for me, it was reckless driving. I'm not proud of it. Not proud of it, but it was a thing that I used to do because I was like, you know what? I just need to drive fast. I need to feel alive.
Fast and Furious.
Pretty much. And you know what? I drive a Standard, so it was kind of cool.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But
Did you do any racing?
didn't do any racing. It was always a solo activity. But I look back on that, right? And that's not something that, like, I look back and I'm like, whoa, my gosh, like that was really dangerous. Like, and like, do I still have like somewhat of an impulsive like personality? Yes, but more like in the sense that like, oh, it's a nice day, like let's go have a campfire without planning it, right? Not like, you know what I need to do? I need to drive really, really fast until I feel alive. So it definitely, like helped with a lot of the more complicated and kind of scarier symptoms and behaviors that come along with having BPD.
Okay.
But yeah.
That's awesome.
I told myself I wasn't going to admit that, but oops.
Oh, you did. We got it out.
That's the impulsivity.
Yeah. Just Tokyo drifting.
Yep.
So you mentioned earlier like the system, and I find this interesting, like, because you go to your doctor and your doctor prescribes the meds for you, and I think that's great. But do you think, like, originally, maybe when you go to the doctor in the first place, everyone should be sent to a psychiatrist?
That's a really difficult question because on one hand, I very much want to say yes, but then on the other hand, I know how the system works, and I know that that's not possible with the way the system works.
Right.
So I guess I would say in order to do so, we need to reroute the system entirely, which is something I think we should do anyway, because it is really difficult to get to see a psychiatrist. The waiting lists are so unbelievably long. I think that if not being put in place on a waiting list to see a psychiatrist, people should at the very least be referred to a therapist, like right away. At the end of the day, on PEI, do we have a lot of therapists? No. But do we have more therapists than we have psychiatrists? Yes. And I know in my own experience,
have any say in meds?
From my understanding, I don't think there's a particular type of therapist that you're able to have a say and can actually like have some power within that decision. I don't remember what it's called, or if maybe I'm just imagining it, but at least my experience, I've never had a therapist that I've had therapists that suggest, oh, hey, I think in addition to being on an antidepressant, you should probably take medication for your anxiety, maybe mention that to your doctor.
Right.
But I've also had, with every therapist that I have had, except for one, I think, they've all collaborated with my family doctor or now with my psychiatrist. So they've all like had each other's number, and before I would have like an appointment with my family doctor, they would contact my therapist and say, hey, how's Hannah doing? What are things looking like? What do you think, as, you know, someone who's more objective than Hannah is, right? Like, so there was always some collaboration, which once again, I could just be very lucky in that situation because the system is very messy and muddled, and I'm not sure if that's a luxury that everyone gets to have.
Yeah, no, it seems very hard to navigate, which is too bad because it's, you know, mental health is already very hard to navigate yourself. I have heard of that situation where there's collaboration, but it just seems like it takes a very long time to get there, and like everybody has to be willing. But you know, it just makes me think, because I know like the average doctor in Canada has 5 minutes with a patient. And I don't know what your experience is like talking, but like this is like, you know, we've just kind of started into your story, you know, and it's probably just, we're just getting into it. It's been, I don't know, half hour or 40 minutes or something, but like, it's hard for me to believe that you could really get to the bottom of what is going on with someone in less than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And it's good that at least we have that, because that's a luxury a lot of people don't have around the world. But, you know, it just seems like it could be better.
Yeah, it could be better, and I think we need to continue to try and make it better. I've said it, I don't know how many times before. I love my doctor. She's great. I know that I've definitely been extremely lucky in my experience of having appointments with her, because I've had appointments with that woman that probably were only, she slotted 10 minutes and they ended up being an hour. So no, I was very, very lucky in my situation, which is sad to say that I was lucky to have the attention and care that I needed. It's sad that we have to consider that a luxury. But as it currently stands, that's the name of the game.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a tough thing. You know, I'm glad that on one hand that people can just get medication if they need it, you know, if they say like, I'm feeling depressed, but it just seems to me like, you know, there's so much more going on, like, you know, but yeah. So hopefully by doing this, it brings awareness. That's kind of so that kind of brings us to now within the last year. So how have you been like over the last year switching the new meds and,
you know, the last year has been, it's been a roller coaster for the good, the bad, the ugly. So, like I said, last year, I had been knocked down from where my place on the mountain. I'd been knocked down, uh, and I had taken the steps to get back up. And I actually I was shocked because this particular friend group that I mentioned before, I was really scared because in one way or another, all of them were leaving the island for most of the summer. And they were all leaving around the same time. And I was petrified. I was so scared because I was like, what am I going to do without my friends? Like, what am I going to do? Like, I'll have no one. And I was so scared. But as time went on and I kind of slowly made my way back up that mountain, I was like shocked at how well I was doing and how much better I felt. And I had one of these friends actually came back to the island for a visit, and we were hanging out, and a really unfortunate traumatic situation happened. And that really put a damper on things because my whole world was kind of, my whole world was rocked. It was shaken. And it was really, really frustrating and painful because every other person within that friend group that I had thought I'd finally found this group of people that, you know, was going to be there forever. Every single person in that group decided that based off of what had happened, that they were not going to believe me and instead believe this other individual, and decided that they wanted nothing to do with me anymore. So I'd already gone through the mental process of, oh my gosh, what am I going to do without these people? I'm going to lose them all. And then I went through the actual experience of, oh, they are all leaving. I am like kind of alone in a sense. So then the very end of last summer was very turbulent. I kind of fell back into a lot of that impulsive behavior, just in different ways. I made a lot of decisions that in the moment I was like, yeah, I'm coping, I'm feeling good, like I feel better now. And then I would, like the next day I'd be like, that was silly of me, that I don't feel better because I did that. And everyone that I told was like, you're moving to Toronto, everything's, you know what, moving to a new city will really improve. And you know, I did not believe them. I was like, just because I'm moving to a new place doesn't mean that I'm going to feel better. I was very wrong, because moving to a new place was actually extremely helpful, because I was able to actually be physically removed from the place of this really recent trauma. So yeah, I moved to Toronto for school, because yeah, I was planning on going to medical school. I interviewed and all that stuff, and then I took a complete 180 and decided to go to theater school in Toronto. And it was really nice to be able to kind of have a fresh start, because in a sense it felt like a little bit of a reset. It felt like in a way, it felt like I didn't have that recent knockdown. It felt kind of like, okay, that happened, but also I'm starting in a new place anyway. And at least for myself, it was really helpful to be able to deal with that trauma in a literally different location. It was really helpful. And I kind of have this thing about unapologetic honesty, has kind of been a thing that I've been trying to do the past year or so. So I was very, very open about the fact that, you know, I had just had this very traumatic experience 2 weeks before starting school. And it was just, you know, a lot of growth and learning, a lot of pain and anger, a lot of tears. But I think, yeah, the fact that I was actually able to be in a completely new situation was unbelievably helpful for me. Coming back to the island for Christmas was a really difficult thing, because the last time I had been here had been associated with this really awful experience. But it was kind of nice to be able to come back and do that in a small dose. To be like, okay, I know I'm only here for 3 weeks, and then I'm going to go back to Toronto. So then I went back to Toronto and just kind of really developing friendships and growing and trying to learn more about myself was so what I needed to be not here. And then I'm not gonna lie, coming back to PEI, especially the first couple weeks that I was actually not in self-isolation, that I was able to leave my house, was really, really difficult. But as every day goes by, it gets a little bit easier and it gets better. And I know that I do not need to be defined by this traumatic situation. It's kind of, once again, that idea of emotions, of either like pushing them away or holding on to them. And I guess what I've decided to do as of right now is to acknowledge its existence, but not cling to it and not push it away. And unfortunately, that experience was a way of kind of the process of elimination of people that are helpful and healthy to my life and people that are damaging. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad people. It just means that they're not the people to be in my life in this time, in this season. So that kind of brings us to now. And I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, everything's great now, everything's easy, and I go to therapy and I take my meds and that makes everything perfect, because it doesn't. But I think every day I learn more about myself and more about how to cope with the situations that I've been through and to cope with my illness, all in a healthier, more productive way, while still learning about having compassion, not only for others, but compassion for myself.
That's awesome. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for sharing everything.
Oh, thank you.
And that makes me happy that, just hearing, I always love hearing stories of where, the journey's gradually getting better, the metaphoric mountain.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say the best of luck with everything, and thanks so much for sharing. Hopefully this will
Thank
help
you.
All right, Hannah, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.